What if the most important place in human history was never meant to be found? What if it was never lost, never destroyed, never buried beneath ice or sea, but quietly removed not from the earth but from the way we understand the world? Long before satellites traced every coastline, before longitude and latitude caged the planet in numbers, ancient people believed the world extended beyond what the eye could see and beyond what the foot could reach. They believed that past the furthest winds, past the last mountains, past the final threshold of human endurance, there existed a land unlike any other. A land where the sun did not burn but blessed, where time did not decay but lingered, where humanity lived as it was once meant to live. They called it Hyperborea, and for centuries this name carried weight not as fantasy but as memory. Tonight we are not searching for a lost continent. We are searching for something far more unsettling. We are searching for the moment when humanity stopped believing that such a place could exist at all. Because Hyperborea did not vanish in a cataclysm, it vanished in silence. To the modern mind, the idea of a hidden civilization beyond the northern horizon sounds like myth in the dismissive sense, a poetic invention, a metaphor, a story told to children. But this is not how the ancient world understood Hyperborea. For them, it was not imaginary. It was elsewhere. And elsewhere was still real. In the ancient Greek imagination, the world was not flat in meaning, even if it was uncertain in shape. Geography was moral, direction carried symbolism, distance implied transformation. The farther one traveled from the familiar, the closer one came not to chaos but to the divine, and nowhere embodied this more than the north. The north was not merely colder, it was purer, still, untouched. The Greeks believed the cold preserved what heat destroyed. That rot belonged to warmth, not frost, that the slow, frozen lands resisted decay. Beyond the north wind, beyond Boreas, lay a region unreachable by ordinary men, not because ships could not sail there, but because the world itself changed as one approached it. This was Hyperborea, a place where war did not exist because it was unnecessary, where disease did not exist because life was balanced, where people did not struggle against nature because nature had not turned against them. Hyperborea was not advanced in the modern sense. It had no machines, no empires, no monuments reaching toward the sky. It did not need them. It had something far rarer, harmony. To understand why the ancients believed in Hyperborea, we must abandon the modern assumption that myths were lies waiting to be corrected by science. Myths were not failed science. They were compressed truth. In a world without libraries, without printing presses, without databases, knowledge had to survive centuries of retelling. Facts alone could not do this. Meaning had to be woven into story. Memory had to be anchored to emotion, ritual, and symbol. Hyperborea was one of these anchors. It was a story that explained why the world felt broken. If there was once a place without suffering, then suffering was not inevitable. If harmony existed somewhere, then disorder was not permanent. If the gods themselves visited this land, then divinity had not abandoned humanity. It had simply moved beyond reach. This mattered because ancient people did not believe history moved forward. They believed it moved downward, from an age of closeness to the gods, to an age of heroes, to an age of men, to an age of iron. Hyperborea was not the future. It was the past, still existing somewhere beyond the edge of decline. Ancient poets spoke of Hyperboreans as people who lived for centuries, not because they had conquered death, but because death came slowly to those who lived rightly. Their lives were filled with music, feasting, and ritual, not excess but celebration. They were said to know neither tyranny nor slavery. Their kings ruled by wisdom, not force. Their society did not fracture into rich and poor because scarcity was unknown. And most telling of all, they did not worship the gods in desperation. They welcomed them as guests. According to Greek tradition, the god Apollo, the god of light, reason, harmony, and proportion, left the civilized world each winter and traveled north to Hyperborea. There he rested, there he renewed himself. There the sun god returned to something older and calmer than the human world he governed. This is not a small detail. Apollo was not fleeing chaos, he was returning home. To the Greeks, this meant something profound. The source of order did not originate in cities, laws, or temples. It originated beyond them. Civilization was an echo, not the source. Yet for all its importance, Hyperborea was never placed precisely on a map. This was not an oversight, it was intentional. Ancient maps were not designed to help you get somewhere. They were designed to help you understand where you were. The center of the world was not a coordinate, it was meaning. Delphi was the navel of the world not because it sat at a measurable midpoint, but because it represented balance between heaven and earth. Hyperborea could not be drawn because it was not meant to be reached. It was meant to orient the soul. The farther north one traveled, the more the world simplified, fewer people, fewer conflicts, fewer distractions, until finally one reached a place beyond struggle itself. Whether such a place physically existed mattered less than what it represented, the belief that perfection was possible without domination. This belief shaped ethics, religion, and identity, and that is why it endured. But beliefs do not disappear without reason. They are replaced, slowly, subtly, often without resistance. As Greek thought evolved, something began to change, not in what people believed, but in how they believed. Observation began to challenge tradition. Measurement began to challenge meaning. Travelers returned with reports not of perfect northern lands, but of harsh climates, hostile tribes, endless ice. The world was shrinking, and as it shrank, there was less room for places that existed beyond experience. Hyperborea did not collapse under evidence. It faded under indifference. When the world became something to be mastered, charted, and owned, there was no longer space for a land that could not be exploited. A place that offered wisdom instead of resources became irrelevant. And so Hyperborea slipped quietly out of history, not disproven, but unnecessary. Yet even now, something remains unresolved. Why did so many cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, imagine a sacred land in the far north or far beyond? Why does the idea of a peaceful origin refuse to die? Why do we keep returning to the belief that something precious was lost, not through failure but through forgetting? Hyperborea lingers because it speaks to a suspicion we rarely voice, that progress may not be synonymous with improvement. That knowledge may come at the cost of wisdom, that by mapping the world completely, we may have erased something essential from it. This documentary is not about proving that Hyperborea existed. It is about understanding why humanity needed it to exist. Because in searching for Hyperborea, we are not looking for a place. We are looking for a standard, a reminder. A question that refuses to leave us alone. If such a world once seemed possible, what happened to us? If Hyperborea was only a myth, it should have died easily. Myths without purpose do not survive scrutiny. They fade when challenged, dissolve when questioned, and collapse when the world grows more precise. Yet Hyperborea endured, not for decades, not for centuries, but for millennia. It passed through poets, historians, priests, and philosophers, each generation repeating the name with quiet certainty, even as its physical location remained elusive. This persistence tells us something crucial. Hyperborea was not sustained by evidence, it was sustained by function. To the ancient world, Hyperborea answered questions no map could solve. To understand this, we must step inside the ancient mindset, not observe it from a distance, but inhabit it. The ancient Greek world was surrounded by uncertainty. Earthquakes shattered cities without warning. Plagues erased populations. Wars erupted over honor, land, and pride. Life was fragile, short, and unforgiving. And yet the Greeks did not respond to this chaos by imagining a future utopia. They imagined an origin. They believed the world began in balance and drifted away from it. That humanity once lived closer to the divine, closer to nature, closer to itself. Hyperborea was not a dream of what could be built, it was a memory of what had been lost. This distinction matters. A future utopia demands power, technology, and control. A lost golden age demands humility, restraint, and remembrance. Hyperborea taught that perfection did not require domination. It required alignment. The Greeks were not alone in this belief. Across ancient cultures, the most sacred places were not located in the present or the future, but in a distant elsewhere, often in a direction marked by danger, cold, or isolation. These were not places of conquest, but places of origin. The North, in particular, occupied a strange psychological position. It was feared, respected, and idealized all at once. It was harsh, yet pure. Empty, yet full of meaning. In a world governed by cycles, the rising and setting sun, the turning seasons, the return of constellations, the north appeared different. The pole star barely moved, the heavens seemed fixed, time itself appeared to slow. To ancient observers, this was not coincidence, it was a sign. The north was where change lost its grip. Hyperborea emerged naturally from this perception, not as fantasy, but as explanation. As Greek thinkers began recording knowledge more systematically, Hyperborea did not disappear. Instead, it transformed. Early historians struggled with it. They acknowledged the stories, documented the traditions, but hesitated to assert physical certainty. This tension between belief and skepticism did not weaken the myth, it strengthened it. Hyperborea became a boundary concept, a place where the limits of knowledge were openly admitted. Rather than pretending to know everything, the ancients preserved space for mystery. Hyperborea marked the edge of comprehension, the point where human understanding gave way to reverence. This is something modern thinking rarely allows. We are uncomfortable with unknowns. We feel compelled to fill gaps, label uncertainties, and dismiss what cannot be verified. But the ancient world understood something we have forgotten, that not all truths can be measured, and not all realities must be conquered. Hyperborea survived because it refused to be reduced, but this resistance came at a cost. As centuries passed, Greek thought shifted, philosophy matured, mathematics advanced, astronomy refined itself. The world became less symbolic and more structural, and with this shift came a subtle but profound transformation. Truth began to mean accuracy rather than meaning. This did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly. Myth and measurement coexisted for generations, sharing space in the human mind, but eventually tension grew. The question was no longer, what does this story tell us about who we are? It became, can this story be proven? Hyperborea once again stood at the threshold, and this time the threshold was closing. Travelers ventured north and returned with conflicting reports. Some spoke of endless forests and distant tribes. Others described ice-bound seas and lifeless tundra. None found the land of eternal spring and joy that poets had sung about, but the absence of proof did not immediately destroy belief. Instead, it triggered reinterpretation. Perhaps Hyperborea was farther north than anyone had traveled. Perhaps it existed in an earlier age. Perhaps it had retreated as humanity changed. These explanations preserved the myth while accommodating new knowledge. Yet each accommodation weakened Hyperborea's authority. A sacred truth that must constantly defend itself eventually loses its power. At the same time, a new worldview was emerging, one that measured reality not by harmony but by utility. Land became territory, distance became challenge, nature became obstacle. In this framework, Hyperborea offered nothing. It could not be traded with, it could not be conquered, it could not be governed. And so it became irrelevant, not false, irrelevant. This distinction is vital. Hyperborea did not vanish because it was disproven. It vanished because it no longer served the dominant way of thinking. When the purpose of knowledge shifted from understanding to control, a land that symbolized balance without power had no place. Yet even as Hyperborea faded from serious discourse, it refused to die entirely. It lingered at the edges of imagination, resurfacing whenever civilization questioned itself, whenever progress felt hollow. Whenever advancement produced unease rather than fulfillment, the myth became dormant, not extinct, and dormant myths are the most dangerous and powerful of all because they return. Consider what Hyperborea offered that modern society struggles to replace. It offered the idea that human life could be meaningful without expansion, that happiness did not require growth, that harmony did not require innovation. These ideas are deeply unsettling to a culture built on perpetual motion. If Hyperborea was right, even symbolically, then something essential has been sacrificed in the pursuit of progress, and that possibility is difficult to face. So instead, the myth was set aside, but setting aside is not the same as forgetting. As time passed, Hyperborea slipped further from mainstream thought, but traces remained embedded in language, ritual, and unconscious expectation. The longing for an untouched land, the fascination with the Arctic as mysterious and sacred. The persistent belief that wisdom lies far from civilization. These are not coincidences, they are echoes. Echoes of a time when humanity believed that perfection did not need to be built, it needed to be remembered. This brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Hyperborea was not erased by new knowledge, it was erased by a change in values. When humans began to define success by dominance over nature rather than harmony with it, the idea of a peaceful, self-sustaining civilization became implausible, not because it was impossible, but because it was undesirable. A society that does not conquer does not expand. A society that does not expand does not accumulate power. A society without power does not shape history as we record it. And so history moved on without Hyperborea. But myths have a way of resurfacing when their absence becomes noticeable, when societies grow restless, when abundance fails to bring peace, when control fails to bring meaning. Hyperborea waits for such moments, not as a destination but as a mirror. It asks a question that remains unanswered. What if the greatest achievement of civilization is not progress but restraint? What if the most advanced society is not the one that changes the world fastest, but the one that changes itself least? These questions are not comfortable. That is why Hyperborea remains just beyond reach. As we continue this journey, we will move deeper, away from poetry and into structure, away from longing and into comparison. We will examine how Hyperborea fits into a global pattern of lost northern homelands, how similar myths emerge across cultures that never met, how the idea of a sacred origin refuses to disappear, even when stripped of names and stories. And we will ask a question that challenges modern certainty. If so many ancient cultures remembered a world of balance before history began, why are we so certain they were wrong? To move forward in this investigation, we must first dismantle a quiet assumption that shapes how modern audiences hear ancient stories. The assumption is this, that similarity implies imitation. When we notice that cultures across the world describe lost golden ages, sacred northern homelands, or primordial lands of harmony, the instinctive explanation is diffusion. that one culture copied another, that myths spread along trade routes, that stories migrated with people. Sometimes this is true, but often it is not. In many cases, the similarities are too deep, too structural, too symbolically aligned to be explained by simple borrowing. The patterns emerge not at the surface level of names and imagery, but at the level of meaning. And meaning does not travel easily. Meaning arises independently, again and again. This is where Hyperborea stops being merely Greek. It becomes human. Across Eurasia, across centuries, across radically different environments, we find the same conceptual elements repeating with remarkable consistency. A primordial land, located far away, often to the north. Associated with longevity, harmony, and divine proximity. Separated from the present world by moral or spiritual decline. The names change, the landscapes differ. The gods wear different faces, but the structure remains. This is not coincidence, it is pattern. To understand why this pattern exists, we must first understand how ancient people thought about time. Modern societies think of time as linear, progressing forward, accumulating knowledge, improving conditions. This model is so ingrained that we rarely question it. Ancient societies did not share this view. For them, time was cyclical or degenerative. The world began in order and moved toward disorder. Each age was weaker, less harmonious, more fragmented than the one before. This belief was not pessimistic, it was observational. They watched soil exhaust itself. They watched traditions weaken. They watched moral codes fracture under power. From this perspective, imagining a perfect beginning was not escapism. It was explanation. Hyperborea fit perfectly into this worldview. It was not a fantasy future. It was a surviving fragment of the original order. This idea appears repeatedly across cultures that had no contact with one another. In ancient India, texts describe a northern land of righteousness and abundance that existed before corruption entered the world. In Iranian tradition, a sacred homeland lies in a cold, luminous region associated with the first humans and the preservation of truth. In Northern Europe, the earliest realms of the gods are described as stable, timeless, and elevated above the chaos of the human world. Even in traditions that place paradise in a garden rather than a polar land, the same logic applies. Humanity begins in harmony and falls away from it. The direction is always backward. The loss is always moral before it is material. Hyperborea is simply one expression of this universal intuition. But why the north? Why not the center of the world? Why not the heavens? Why not the depths of the ocean? The answer lies in perception. To ancient observers living in temperate or Mediterranean climates, the north represented extremity without excess. It was cold but not burning. It was distant but not abstract. It was real yet unreachable. More importantly, it resisted change. Seasons were slower, populations were thinner, political upheaval was minimal. The land itself seemed to preserve what time elsewhere destroyed. To people who equated decay with heat and corruption with abundance, the cold became a symbol of purity. The north did not rot, it endured. Hyperborea did not need to be invented, it was inferred. There is another dimension to this symbolism that is rarely discussed. The north is where orientation collapses. As one travels closer to the pole, directions lose meaning. East and west blur, the sun behaves strangely. Time itself becomes difficult to track. For ancient minds, this was profoundly unsettling and profoundly sacred. A place where normal rules failed was not merely dangerous, it was liminal, a threshold. Hyperborea existed on that threshold between the human and the divine, between the measurable and the meaningful. It was not a place you conquered. It was a place you approached with reverence. This is why attempts to locate Hyperborea using modern logic always fail. they miss the point. Hyperborea was never meant to be found in the way cities are found. It was meant to exist just beyond reach, far enough to remain pure, close enough to remain relevant. This balance is delicate, and it could not survive the next great transformation in human thought. As civilizations grew larger and more complex, something subtle but irreversible happened. Scale changed consciousness. Small societies live within limits. They feel the weight of seasons, scarcity, and dependence. Large societies insulate themselves from these forces. They store food, build infrastructure, project power. With scale comes confidence. With confidence comes hubris. And with hubris comes a shift in myth. Instead of remembering a lost perfection, civilizations begin imagining future dominance. Instead of harmony, they pursue expansion. Instead of restraint, they celebrate growth. Hyperborea, once a quiet reminder of balance, became an inconvenience. Its message contradicted the trajectory of empire. Empires do not like myths that imply decline. They prefer myths of destiny, chosen peoples, manifest futures, inevitable triumphs. Hyperborea offered none of these. It did not justify conquest. It did not reward ambition. It did not place power at the center of meaning, and so it was quietly sidelined, not attacked, not refuted, simply ignored. This is often how the most dangerous ideas are handled. Yet even as Hyperborea retreated from official narratives, it continued to shape thought indirectly. Philosophers spoke of natural order. Poets lamented lost innocence. Mystics sought wisdom far from cities. The structure remained even as the name faded, and this persistence reveals something important. Hyperborea was not dependent on belief, it was dependent on longing. As long as humans felt that something essential had been lost, the myth would remain alive in some form. This brings us to a difficult question. What exactly was believed to be lost? It was not technology, it was not comfort, it was not knowledge in the modern sense, it was alignment. Alignment between humans and nature, between desire and necessity, between action and consequence. Hyperborea symbolized a world where these alignments had not yet fractured, a world where restraint was natural, not enforced. This is why the Hyperboreans did not need laws. Law arises when harmony fails. Modern audiences often struggle with this idea because we are conditioned to see order as imposed rather than emergent. We assume peace requires enforcement. We assume stability requires surveillance. We assume cooperation requires incentive. Hyperborea challenges these assumptions at their root. It suggests that disorder is not humanity's default state. It suggests that conflict is not inevitable. It suggests that something in us once knew how to live without constant correction. Whether or not this was ever historically true is almost beside the point. The fact that so many cultures believed it was possible is what matters. As we move deeper into this documentary, we will begin to examine how Hyperborea intersects with archaeology, climate history, and human migration, not to validate the myth literally, but to understand why it took the shape it did. We will explore how memory behaves over vast spans of time, how stories can preserve emotional truth long after factual detail has eroded, how the human mind encodes experience into symbol when direct recall is impossible. And we will confront a question that grows more unsettling the longer we sit with it. What if Hyperborea is not a place we failed to discover, but a way of being we failed to protect? Because if that is the case, then the myth is not about the past. It is about responsibility, and that is far more difficult to dismiss. At this point in our journey, a quiet tension has formed. On one side stands myth, rich, symbolic, emotionally charged. On the other stands modern reasoning, skeptical, empirical, restrained. Between them lies a question neither side can fully answer alone. How does memory survive when history does not? because Hyperborea behaves less like a legend invented at a moment in time and more like a recollection stretched beyond recognition, distorted, reframed, yet stubbornly persistent. To understand this, we must confront an uncomfortable truth about human memory. Memory is not archival, it is adaptive. When details fade, meaning remains. When events become unreachable, emotions survive. When places are lost, patterns endure. Hyperborea may not be a memory of a specific location, but it may be the memory of a condition. Modern societies are accustomed to thinking of the past as primitive. We imagine our ancestors struggling in ignorance, clawing their way forward toward the sophistication we now enjoy. This assumption is deeply ingrained and deeply flawed. Ancient people were not intellectually inferior. They were differently oriented. Their intelligence was ecological rather than technical, relational rather than analytical, integrative rather than specialized. They understood patterns we have forgotten because they lived inside them. Seasonal cycles were not abstractions, they governed survival. Environmental balance was not an ideal, it was necessity. Social cohesion was not optional, it was the difference between continuity and extinction. When ancient cultures imagined a time of harmony, they were not fantasizing. They were remembering conditions under which survival was possible. Hyperborea reflects this remembrance. Consider what happens when a society crosses a certain threshold of complexity. Surplus emerges, hierarchy solidifies, power concentrates. With these changes come advantages, but also consequences. Decision-making becomes abstract, responsibility diffuses, actions disconnect from immediate outcomes. A forest can be cut by people who never see its absence. A river can be poisoned by those who never drink from it. A war can be declared by those who never fight. This disconnection is not moral failure, it is structural, and ancient societies noticed it. They felt that something essential was being lost as communities grew larger, faster, and more stratified. Hyperborea is one way they expressed this intuition, a world without excess, without domination, without separation between action and consequence, a world small enough to remain whole. This brings us to a crucial insight. Hyperborea is not a story about technological simplicity. It is a story about scale. The Hyperboreans are not described as ignorant. They are described as wise, not weak but content, not stagnant but stable. Their society does not progress because it does not need to. This challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions of modern civilization, that growth is inherently good. In Hyperborea, growth is unnecessary because balance has already been achieved. This idea is radical, even today. The reason this idea feels so foreign is because modern civilization has replaced balance with momentum. We no longer ask whether growth improves life, we ask only whether growth is possible. But ancient cultures understood something intuitively. Systems that grow without limit collapse. Biology teaches this. Ecology demonstrates it. History confirms it. Hyperborea stands as a symbolic counterpoint, a vision of a society that chose equilibrium over expansion. Whether such a society ever existed at scale is uncertain, but the fact that humans imagined it repeatedly suggests a deep awareness of growth's dangers. This awareness did not disappear. It went underground. As history moved forward, myths like Hyperborea were stripped of authority, but their psychological function remained. The longing they expressed did not vanish, it adapted. It resurfaced as pastoral nostalgia, as philosophical idealism, as religious longing, as the search for untouched wilderness. Each of these is Hyperborea in disguise. When modern individuals dream of escaping civilization, of living simply, of returning to nature, they are participating in the same impulse that once gave rise to Hyperborea. The language has changed, the desire has not. At this stage, it is tempting to dismiss Hyperborea as mere symbolism, a useful metaphor but nothing more. But this dismissal overlooks something important. Symbols are not arbitrary. They emerge from repeated experience, shared across generations, reinforced by survival. A symbol that persists for thousands of years is not decorative. It is diagnostic. It tells us what humans struggle with most deeply. And Hyperborea tells us that humans struggle with imbalance. Nowhere is this more evident than in the way Hyperborea is positioned relative to civilization. It is always outside, always distant, always removed from centers of power. This is not accidental. The ancients did not believe wisdom emerged from authority. They believed authority often corrupted wisdom. Hyperborea's distance was its protection. By placing the ideal society beyond reach, ancient cultures ensured it could not be claimed, ruled, or exploited. It remained uncontaminated by ambition. This is a profound insight. The moment a perfect society becomes accessible, it becomes vulnerable. Hyperborea survives precisely because it cannot be reached. Modern attempts to literalize Hyperborea, to locate it geographically, to tie it to specific archaeological sites, often miss this essential point. Even if a highly organized, peaceful culture once existed in the far north, the myth of Hyperborea would still not be about that culture. It would be about what that culture represented to those who remembered it. Memory does not preserve facts, it preserves meaning. This brings us to one of the most important transitions in this documentary. Up to now, we have examined Hyperborea as an ancient idea, its origins, its symbolism, its disappearance. Now we must ask a harder question. Why does Hyperborea matter now? Why does a myth discarded by science continue to feel relevant in an age of unprecedented knowledge and power? The answer lies not in the past, but in the present. Modern civilization is extraordinarily capable. It can alter climates, reshape genomes, collapse distances, rewrite landscapes. Yet despite this power, dissatisfaction grows. Rates of anxiety rise, alienation deepens, trust erodes. We have mastered systems but lost connection. Hyperborea speaks directly to this condition. It does not offer solutions, it offers contrast. It reminds us that humanity once imagined fulfillment without acceleration, that it once believed harmony was possible without control, that it once placed wisdom beyond power. These are not answers, they are provocations. And provocations are dangerous. They destabilize certainty. This is why Hyperborea has always existed at the margins of accepted knowledge. It asks questions civilization does not like to answer. What if efficiency is not the highest value? What if dominance is not strength? What if progress can be regression? These questions undermine the foundations of modern identity, so they are rarely asked, but myths do not need permission to speak. They operate beneath logic, beneath ideology, beneath rational defense. They emerge in art, in dreams, in dissatisfaction, in longing. Hyperborea does not argue, it haunts, and haunting ideas are often the most important. As we continue forward, we will begin to examine how Hyperborea intersects with tangible evidence, not to validate it as a lost civilization, but to explore how environmental change, migration, and memory interact. We will look at what happens when climates shift rapidly, when lands disappear, when populations move faster than stories can adapt. We will explore how ancient experiences of catastrophe may have been encoded into myth, not as dates and data, but as longing and loss. And we will ask a question that modern thinking rarely allows itself to consider seriously. What if some myths are not inventions, but survivals? What if they are not explanations of the world? but messages from a world that no longer exists. Because if that is true, then Hyperborea is not asking us to believe in it. It is asking us to listen. To listen properly, however, we must slow down. Modern thinking moves quickly. It jumps from question to conclusion, from mystery to dismissal. But Hyperborea does not reveal itself to speed. It reveals itself through patience, through the careful layering of perspective. So now we step into a deeper layer of this story, the layer where myth brushes against environment, where memory intersects with climate, and where human experience stretches beyond recorded history. Because while Hyperborea may not be a place marked on maps, it emerges repeatedly at moments when the world itself was changing. And that is not accidental. For most of human existence, the planet was not stable in the way we experience it today. Coastlines shifted. Ice advanced and retreated. Forests expanded and vanished. Entire ecosystems appeared and disappeared within human lifetimes. To live in such a world was to understand impermanence intimately. Yet even within this instability, there were periods of relative balance, windows of time when climates softened, resources stabilized, and human populations flourished without excessive strain. These periods did not last forever, and when they ended, the memory of them did not vanish, it transformed. Imagine a people who live in a land where survival is difficult but predictable. Seasons come and go in familiar rhythms. Resources are limited but reliable. Social structures evolve to maintain equilibrium. Now imagine that land becoming unrecognizable within a few generations. Temperatures drop, growing seasons shorten. Migration becomes necessary. Old ways fail. To later generations, the ancestral homeland does not feel merely distant. It feels better. Not because it was perfect, but because it was comprehensible. Hyperborea may be the echo of such remembrance, not of a utopia, but of a time when the world made sense. This is where modern archaeology and ancient myth begin to speak to one another, not directly, not conclusively, but suggestively. Archaeology deals in fragments, tools, bones, fire pits, traces of movement. It reconstructs behavior, not belief. Myth deals in meaning, stories, symbols, values. It preserves belief, not behavior. Where they overlap, something interesting happens, patterns emerge. Human populations repeatedly retreat from regions that become inhospitable. They carry stories with them, stories of where they came from, stories of what was lost, stories of how life once was. Over time, these stories simplify, details erode, names change, events blur, but emotional truth survives. Hyperborea may be one such emotional truth. Notice how often Hyperborea is described as existing before corruption entered the world. This language is moral, but it may also be environmental. When conditions worsen, life becomes harsher. Competition intensifies, hierarchies emerge, conflict increases. From the perspective of descendants, this feels like moral decline. The world did not merely become colder or drier, it became crueler. And so the past is remembered not just as easier, but as better. Hyperborea is that better world, remembered without its hardships, preserved without its complexity. Not because ancestors lied, but because memory filters suffering differently than it filters loss. There is another dimension to this that deserves careful attention. When people are forced to migrate, they do not leave everything behind. They leave graves, sacred sites, ancestral landmarks, places where stories are anchored. To abandon these places is traumatic, not just practically, but spiritually. The land itself holds identity. When it is lost, identity fractures. Hyperborea may represent a world where that fracture had not yet occurred, a world where people belonged fully to land, to community, to tradition. This sense of belonging is one of the deepest human needs, and it is one of the first casualties of large-scale disruption. Modern audiences often underestimate how profoundly place shapes consciousness. In a stable environment, traditions reinforce themselves. Knowledge passes cleanly from generation to generation. Ritual aligns with season. Identity feels natural. In unstable environments, everything becomes provisional. Customs change, roles shift, certainty erodes. Hyperborea stands as the opposite of this condition. It is imagined stability, continuity without rupture. Whether or not such a place ever existed indefinitely is less important than the fact that humans needed to believe it once did. At this point, a subtle realization begins to emerge. Hyperborea is not simply a myth about the past. It is a response to loss, and loss is not abstract. Loss is lived. This understanding changes how we interpret the details of the myth. The Hyperboreans live long lives, not because they defy biology, but because stability reduces stress, violence, and premature death. They live without war not because they are morally superior, but because scarcity has not yet forced competition to the breaking point. They live in harmony with nature, not because they worship it abstractly, but because their survival remains directly tied to its rhythms. Hyperborea is not supernatural, it is pre-fracture. This also explains why Hyperborea is always placed just beyond reach. Loss is easier to bear when it is distant. If the golden world were nearby, its absence would be unbearable. If it were accessible, its contrast would provoke despair. Distance softens grief. Myth gives it form. Hyperborea is grief structured into story. As societies became more complex, they required new myths that justified hierarchy, conquest, and expansion. Hyperborea did not serve these needs. It did not explain why some ruled and others obeyed. It did not validate accumulation. It did not promise reward for ambition, so it was replaced by narratives of destiny, chosenness, and progress. But replacement is never complete. The older myth remains beneath the surface. This is why Hyperborea resurfaces during moments of crisis. When civilizations doubt themselves, they look backward. When growth feels destructive, restraint becomes attractive again. When power fails to deliver meaning, harmony regains its appeal. Hyperborea does not return as belief, it returns as longing. This longing is visible today in unexpected ways, in the romanticization of simple living, in the idealization of remote communities, in the search for untouched wilderness, in the discomfort with endless acceleration. These impulses are often dismissed as nostalgia or escapism, but they are more than that. They are signals. They indicate a mismatch between human psychology and the systems we have built. Hyperborea articulates that mismatch without naming it. At this stage, it becomes clear why Hyperborea could never be permanently erased. It does not belong to any one culture. It belongs to a condition. Whenever humans experience disconnection from land, from community, from consequence, Hyperborea becomes relevant again. It stands as a reminder that another mode of existence was once imaginable. That imagination alone is powerful. As we move toward the next part of this documentary, we will begin narrowing our focus. We will examine specific traditions, symbols, and narratives that orbit Hyperborea, especially those connected to sacred authority, ritual, and the idea of divine origin. We will explore how myths do not merely describe worlds but legitimize values. And we will ask a question that becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. If Hyperborea represents balance, and balance is something we continue to lose, is the myth warning us or inviting us? Because there is a difference. A warning tells us what will happen if we continue. An invitation asks us to choose differently. Hyperborea may be offering both. At this stage, the story of Hyperborea begins to turn inward, not away from the world, but toward the structures that give the world meaning. Because myths do not survive merely by describing landscapes, they survive by legitimizing values. And Hyperborea, more than most myths, is a statement about authority, where it comes from, how it is justified, and what happens when it drifts too far from its source. To understand this, we must look closely at the relationship between sacred power and distance. In the ancient world, legitimacy did not emerge from force alone. Force could seize power, but it could not sanctify it. For a king, a priesthood, or a law to endure, it had to be rooted in something older than itself, something beyond human ambition. This is where Hyperborea played a quiet but crucial role. It existed as a source of legitimacy that could not be controlled. It was beyond borders, beyond armies, beyond dynasties, and because it was unreachable, it was incorruptible. Consider how often ancient traditions claim that sacred objects, rituals, or lineages originated in distant, mythic lands. This distance is not decorative. It creates authority without ownership. If a ritual comes from nearby, it can be questioned. If it comes from a conquered land, it can be dismissed. But if it comes from a place beyond history, it commands reverence. Hyperborea served this function perfectly. It was close enough to feel connected, but far enough to remain untouchable. This is why in Greek tradition, offerings were said to arrive from Hyperborea at sacred sites. The implication was clear. Sacred order did not originate in the city. The city was a recipient, not a source. This mattered deeply in societies constantly negotiating the tension between power and wisdom. Hyperborea ensured that no ruler could claim ultimate authority. Something older and purer always stood behind them. This dynamic reveals something subtle but profound. Hyperborea was not just a myth of origin, it was a limit, a reminder that human systems are provisional, that no law is final, that no empire is absolute, that no civilization is the measure of all things. As long as Hyperborea existed in the cultural imagination, there was always a reference point beyond human control. This restrained excess, at least in theory, but restraint is fragile. As societies grow more complex, the temptation to collapse legitimacy inward, to claim divine authority for oneself, becomes overwhelming. Kings become chosen by gods, empires become destined, expansion becomes righteous. In such a worldview, an external source of authority is inconvenient. It undermines certainty. Hyperborea had to fade for absolute power to flourish. This fading did not occur through confrontation. It occurred through substitution. Rather than pointing beyond the world, myths began pointing forward. Salvation shifted from remembrance to destiny. The sacred moved from elsewhere to ahead. This change altered everything. When legitimacy comes from the future rather than the past, restraint weakens. The future can justify anything. Sacrifice today becomes acceptable for promised greatness tomorrow. Hyperborea, by contrast, demanded humility. It reminded people that perfection had already existed and had been lost. This implies failure, and failure is not a story empires like to tell. Yet even as Hyperborea retreated from political relevance, it continued to exert influence in subtler ways. Philosophers spoke of natural law principles older than any state. Mystics sought wisdom in isolation rather than institutions. Poets mourned the loss of simplicity and balance. These are not separate movements, they are fragments of the same impulse, the impulse to ground meaning beyond power. Hyperborea is the purest expression of that impulse. There is another reason Hyperborea remained compelling long after belief in it weakened. It resolved a contradiction at the heart of human experience. Humans are capable of extraordinary cruelty. And yet we retain a persistent belief that cruelty is wrong. Where does this belief come from? If history is a record of domination and conflict, why do we judge it? Hyperborea provides an answer. It suggests that violence is deviation, not norm, that cruelty is corruption, not essence, that somewhere, sometime, human life aligned with its deeper nature. This belief matters. It preserves moral possibility. Without such a reference point, morality becomes arbitrary. Power defines good. Survival justifies anything. History becomes excuse rather than warning. Hyperborea prevents this collapse. Even symbolically, it insists that humanity is capable of more than it often displays, that our worst behaviors are not our truest ones. This is why the myth endures. It protects hope without promising utopia. As the centuries passed and belief systems evolved, Hyperborea gradually lost its name, but not its function. The idea of an original harmony migrated into new frameworks. It appeared as the state of nature, as primordial innocence, as divine order, as paradise lost. Each version reflects the same core intuition, that something fundamental preceded complexity. And that complexity, for all its achievements, carries a cost. This intuition became especially potent during periods of upheaval. When societies collapse, people look backward for meaning. When systems fail, origins regain authority. Hyperborea thrives in such moments. It re-emerges not as geography, but as critique. A silent question aimed at the present: is this really the best we can do? This question is uncomfortable because it challenges inevitability. Modern civilization often frames itself as the only possible outcome. Given enough time and intelligence, we assume societies must become large, centralized, and technologically dependent. Hyperborea challenges this assumption. It suggests that alternative paths were once imaginable and perhaps viable. This does not mean they were flawless, but it does mean they were different, and difference matters. At this point, it becomes clear that Hyperborea is not nostalgic fantasy. It is cultural memory resisting erasure, memory of a time when humans experienced themselves as part of systems rather than masters of them, when survival required attention rather than extraction. When meaning emerged from participation rather than control. This memory is inconvenient. It undermines narratives of superiority. It questions the price of progress. It asks whether complexity has outpaced wisdom. These questions are not abstract. They surface today in debates about sustainability, technology, and the future of civilization. They appear whenever growth collides with limits. Hyperborea does not offer solutions to these problems, but it offers perspective. It reminds us that limits are not enemies. They are conditions of balance. As we move forward, we will begin to examine how Hyperborea was reinterpreted and distorted once it re-entered modern thought, how a myth of harmony was transformed into a myth of superiority, how symbolic memory was mistaken for literal ancestry, and how the misuse of ancient myths reveals as much about modern anxieties as it does about ancient beliefs. This is a difficult chapter, but it is necessary. Because myths that are not understood become tools, and tools in the wrong hands are dangerous. Hyperborea deserves better than that. When myths lose their context, they do not disappear, they mutate. Stripped of their symbolic grounding, they become vulnerable to appropriation, reshaped to serve agendas they were never meant to support. Hyperborea, once a quiet reminder of balance and restraint, would eventually undergo such a transformation. And this transformation tells us as much about modernity as the myth tells us about antiquity. As Europe entered the modern age, something unprecedented occurred. The past became an object, no longer a living source of wisdom. It became a field to be studied, categorized, and most importantly, claimed. Languages were dissected, texts were translated, myths were cataloged. This process brought immense knowledge, but it also introduced a dangerous temptation. to treat myth as evidence. In this new intellectual climate, Hyperborea was no longer approached as a symbolic ideal or moral reference point. It was reinterpreted as a historical homeland, a real place, a real people, a real ancestry. This shift was subtle at first, but catastrophic in its implications, because once a myth becomes a claim of origin, it becomes a claim of ownership. The idea that Hyperborea represented harmony was gradually replaced by the idea that it represented primacy. Not balance but superiority, not restraint but purity. The qualities once attributed to a moral condition were reassigned to bloodlines, geographies, and identities. This was a profound distortion, and it did not arise from ancient tradition. It arose from modern anxiety. As industrialization accelerated, societies experienced dislocation on an unprecedented scale. Cities swelled, traditional structures fractured, communities dissolved into masses. Amid this upheaval, many sought certainty in origins. Who are we? Where do we come from? What gives us meaning in a world that no longer feels stable? Myths like Hyperborea were pulled into this search, but instead of being understood as symbols of balance, they were weaponized as symbols of entitlement. This is where the story becomes dangerous, because a myth of harmony can inspire humility, but a myth of superiority inspires domination. The reinterpretation of Hyperborea as an ancestral homeland of a chosen people inverted its original meaning. What was once beyond power was dragged into politics. What was once a limit on authority became its justification. This was not rediscovery, it was projection. The tragedy here is not simply misuse, it is misunderstanding. Hyperborea was never about identity, it was about condition. It did not define who people were, it described how people lived. By transforming it into a marker of origin, modern thinkers erased its ethical core, and in doing so, they revealed something unsettling, that even myths of peace can be twisted into myths of power. This pattern is not unique to Hyperborea. History is filled with examples of ancient symbols repurposed to legitimize modern ambitions. But Hyperborea is particularly instructive because of how stark the reversal is. A myth that once warned against excess became a justification for it. A story that placed perfection beyond reach was used to claim it had already been achieved and inherited. This reversal did not occur because the myth was weak. It occurred because it was powerful. Understanding this distortion is essential, not to condemn the past but to protect the present. Because myths do not disappear when abused. They linger distorted, waiting to be reclaimed or repeated, and Hyperborea still lingers. To reclaim it, we must return to what the myth actually did, not what later interpreters wanted it to do. Hyperborea did not tell people they were better than others. It told them that even the best societies were fragile. That harmony required care. That balance could be lost. These are not messages of entitlement. They are messages of responsibility. The danger of misunderstanding Hyperborea lies in mistaking symbolism for literalism. Symbols are not facts. They are lenses. They help us see relationships, patterns, and limits. When we treat them as historical data, we flatten their meaning and often invert it. Hyperborea as symbol points away from power. As literal homeland, it becomes a claim to power. The difference could not be more important. This brings us to a broader realization about myth itself. Myths are not instructions, they are warnings. They encode lessons learned the hard way through collapse, loss, and suffering. Hyperborea warns against forgetting balance. Against believing that growth has no cost, against assuming that complexity guarantees wisdom. When we ignore these warnings, myths return not as guidance but as critique. The modern world is not short on knowledge, it is short on orientation. We know more than any civilization before us, but we are less certain about what that knowledge is for. Hyperborea speaks to this uncertainty. It reminds us that wisdom is not accumulation, it is alignment between capacity and restraint, between ambition and consequence, between power and responsibility. This is why Hyperborea cannot be reduced to fantasy or dismissed as superstition. It performs a function modern narratives struggle to replace. It provides a reference point outside of progress, a reminder that forward motion is not inherently virtuous, that sometimes the most important movement is inward. At this stage in the documentary, something important has happened. Hyperborea has stopped being a mystery to solve. It has become a mirror reflecting our assumptions about civilization, success, and meaning. The question is no longer whether Hyperborea existed. The question is why we are so uncomfortable with what it implies. Hyperborea implies that a society can be stable without expansion, meaning can exist without dominance, authority, can originate beyond power, progress, can destroy as much as it creates. These implications challenge the narrative foundations of modern life. And that is why they matter. As we prepare to move into the next part of this journey, the focus will shift again, this time toward the internal landscape. We will explore how myths like Hyperborea operate within the human psyche, how they encode values at a level deeper than language, how they shape intuition, desire, and dissatisfaction. And we will confront a final, deeply unsettling possibility, that Hyperborea persists not because it describes a lost world, but because it describes a lost relationship with nature, with community, and with ourselves. If that is true, then rediscovering Hyperborea does not require excavation. It requires reorientation, and that may be the most difficult journey of all. To speak of reorientation is to acknowledge that something has gone off course, not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually, so gradually that it felt like improvement while it was happening. Hyperborea returns to us at this point in the story not as myth, not as warning, but as diagnosis. Because before any civilization collapses materially, it drifts psychologically, and drift is difficult to perceive from within. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. We adapt to noise, to speed, to complexity, to contradiction. We normalize what once would have felt unbearable. And in doing so, we lose the ability to recognize imbalance until it has become extreme. Ancient myths understood this problem intuitively. They preserved images of balance not to recreate them, but to remember what balance felt like. Hyperborea functions this way. It does not tell us how to build a perfect society. It reminds us how far we have moved from the conditions under which societies feel whole. At the psychological level, Hyperborea operates beneath belief. Even those who have never heard the name respond to its structure, the yearning for a simpler life, the discomfort with constant acceleration, the sense that meaning is dissolving under abundance. These are not failures of gratitude, they are signals of misalignment. Hyperborea gives those signals a form. Modern psychology often treats dissatisfaction as individual pathology. Stress is chemical, anxiety is cognitive, depression is neurological. And while these explanations have value, they often ignore context. A system can be functional and still be harmful. A society can be productive and still be psychologically corrosive. Ancient myths understood this holistically. They did not separate inner experience from outer conditions. Hyperborea reflects this integration. It is a vision of a world where inner and outer realities reinforce one another rather than compete. In Hyperborea, people are not described as endlessly happy. They are described as content. Contentment is a word modern culture struggles to define, let alone achieve. It does not rely on novelty. It does not require accumulation. It does not depend on comparison. It emerges when needs align with environment, when identity aligns with role, when effort aligns with outcome. Hyperborea represents this alignment psychologically as much as socially. This is why Hyperborea is often misunderstood as naive. To a culture trained to equate stimulation with fulfillment, contentment looks like stagnation. But ancient cultures recognized something we often forget. Stability is not boredom, it is relief. When life becomes too complex, the nervous system does not celebrate sophistication. It reacts. Constant alerts, constant choices, constant demands fragment attention and erode coherence. The mind adapts, but at a cost. Ancient myths encoded an awareness of this cost long before neuroscience could describe it. Hyperborea is a world without cognitive overload, without perpetual urgency, without the pressure to become something other than what one already is. This does not mean it is a world without challenge. It is a world without chronic dissonance. This distinction is crucial. Hyperborea is not a fantasy of ease. It is a fantasy of fit. Fit between humans and their environment. Fit between effort and reward. Fit between desire and necessity. Modern societies are extraordinarily capable at producing abundance, but notoriously poor at producing fit. This mismatch creates a low-grade distress that becomes background noise. Hyperborea cuts through that noise. It reminds us that distress is not always personal failure. Sometimes it is structural feedback. At this point, the myth begins to function less like a story and more like a compass. Not a map because it does not tell us where to go, but a compass because it tells us when we are facing the wrong direction, when speed replaces purpose, when growth replaces meaning, when control replaces connection. Hyperborea points away from these trajectories. This inward turn also explains why Hyperborea resists literalization. Attempts to anchor it to specific locations or peoples feel unsatisfying because they miss its psychological dimension. Hyperborea is not meant to be found, it is meant to be felt. When people feel disconnected, Hyperborea becomes compelling. When societies feel stable and coherent, the myth fades into the background. Its relevance is proportional to imbalance. This raises an unsettling possibility. The resurgence of interest in ancient myths, lost civilizations, and primordial wisdom may not reflect curiosity about the past. It may reflect discomfort with the present. Hyperborea's return in modern discourse coincides with a growing sense that something is wrong despite unprecedented capability. We have more tools than ever before, and less certainty about how to use them. Ancient myths anticipated this dilemma. They warned that intelligence without wisdom is dangerous, that capability without restraint leads to fragmentation, that complexity without coherence produces anxiety rather than fulfillment. Hyperborea encodes these warnings not as arguments but as images: a peaceful land, a stable people, a world that does not demand constant transformation. These images bypass rational defenses and speak directly to intuition. This intuitive resonance is often mistaken for escapism, but escapism seeks avoidance. Hyperborea seeks orientation. It does not invite us to abandon civilization. It invites us to question its trajectory. It asks whether the direction we are moving aligns with the kind of beings we are. At the deepest level, Hyperborea challenges the modern assumption that humans are infinitely adaptable. We are adaptable, but not infinitely. There are limits to stimulation, to abstraction, to scale. Ancient societies understood limits as sacred. Modern societies treat limits as obstacles. Hyperborea exists to remind us that limits can be protective, that they define the space within which life can flourish. This understanding reframes the myth entirely. Hyperborea is not a critique of technology, it is a critique of imbalance. It does not reject knowledge, it rejects excess divorced from meaning. It does not oppose change. It warns against change without orientation. As we approach the later stages of this documentary, the significance of Hyperborea becomes increasingly clear. It is not asking us to believe in it. It is asking us to listen to what it reveals about ourselves. Why do we feel drawn to images of untouched lands? Why does the idea of a peaceful origin resonate so deeply? Why does acceleration feel both exhilarating and exhausting? These questions do not require ancient answers. They require ancient awareness. Hyperborea preserved that awareness in story form. It survived the collapse of belief systems because it addressed something perennial: the tension between capacity and coherence, the struggle to live well inside systems that grow faster than wisdom, the longing for a life that feels integrated rather than fragmented. In the next part of this journey, we will begin to draw these threads together. We will examine how Hyperborea functions not only as memory and critique, but as threshold. A threshold between myth and philosophy, between past and future, between what humanity has become and what it still might choose to be. Because if Hyperborea is not a place, then it may be a question, and questions, unlike answers, do not expire. If Hyperborea is a question, then it is one we have been circling for a very long time, not consciously, not deliberately, but persistently. Civilizations rarely ask their most dangerous questions directly. Instead, they embed them in story, ritual, and symbol, places where they can be approached without threatening the structures that hold society together. Hyperborea is one of those embedded questions. It asks not how far we can go, but how far is too far. To understand why this question matters now, we must confront a paradox at the heart of modern life. Never before has humanity possessed such capacity for transformation. We can reshape landscapes, manipulate matter at the atomic level, and alter biological processes that once seemed immutable. We can communicate across the planet instantly and store knowledge on a scale unimaginable to previous generations. And yet, despite this unprecedented power, a sense of disorientation persists. Progress no longer feels synonymous with improvement. Acceleration no longer guarantees meaning. Choice no longer produces freedom. Hyperborea emerges precisely at this paradox. Ancient myths did not measure success by output, they measured it by balance. A good life was not defined by accumulation, but by proportion, by knowing when to act and when to refrain, by understanding limits not as restrictions, but as conditions for harmony. Hyperborea embodies this ethic. Its people are not described as conquering nature or bending it to their will. They live within it, attentive to its rhythms, responsive rather than domineering. This worldview does not reject intelligence, it rejects hubris. Hubris is not arrogance alone, it is the belief that consequences can always be managed after the fact. It is the assumption that any problem created by complexity can be solved with more complexity. Ancient cultures recognized this as a dangerous illusion. They encoded that recognition into myth. Hyperborea stands as a counterexample to hubris, a reminder that the most resilient systems are often the simplest, and the most stable societies are often those that resist unnecessary expansion. This resistance to expansion is perhaps the most radical aspect of the myth. In Hyperborea, there is no narrative of destiny pushing outward, no manifest future demanding sacrifice, no imperative to grow. This absence is striking. It suggests a worldview in which fulfillment is not deferred, where meaning is present rather than promised, where life is not a preparation for something else. Modern societies are built on deferral. Work now, live later. Sacrifice today, prosper tomorrow. Endure complexity now, enjoy its benefits eventually. Hyperborea disrupts this logic. It implies that when fulfillment is perpetually postponed, it may never arrive. This implication is uncomfortable because it undermines the moral foundation of endless striving. If the good life cannot be postponed indefinitely, then systems built on perpetual sacrifice become ethically questionable. Hyperborea does not accuse, it exposes. The power of the myth lies in its refusal to resolve tension. It does not tell us whether such a society can exist again. It does not offer blueprints or prescriptions. It simply holds up a contrast, and contrasts have a way of clarifying what arguments cannot. As we move deeper into the implications of Hyperborea, it becomes clear that the myth operates at multiple levels simultaneously. At the cultural level, it critiques unchecked growth. At the psychological level, it speaks to exhaustion and fragmentation. At the philosophical level, it challenges linear notions of progress. And at the ethical level, it asks whether power without restraint is wisdom or folly. These layers are inseparable. Hyperborea endures because it addresses all of them at once. This multidimensional quality explains why Hyperborea resists closure. Every attempt to finalize its meaning feels incomplete. That incompleteness is not a flaw, it is a feature. Myths that offer definitive answers become obsolete. Myths that pose enduring questions remain relevant. Hyperborea belongs to the second category. There is another reason Hyperborea continues to resonate, particularly in times of crisis. It offers a form of hope that does not depend on fantasy. It does not promise salvation through technology. It does not predict inevitable enlightenment. It does not assure us that history bends toward justice. Instead, it suggests that alignment is possible but fragile, that harmony can exist but must be maintained, that wisdom is not guaranteed by advancement. This is a sobering form of hope, but it is also a resilient one. Resilient hope does not collapse when promises fail, it adapts. Hyperborea does not collapse when civilizations disappoint. It re-emerges as critique, as longing, as recalibration. At this point in the documentary, we stand at a threshold. Up to now, Hyperborea has been examined as myth, memory, symbol, and psychological mirror. What remains is to ask how such myths function in shaping the future, not by predicting it, but by influencing how we imagine it, because imagination precedes action. And the futures we build are constrained by the stories we tell ourselves about what is possible. Modern narratives of the future tend to oscillate between two extremes: total collapse or total transcendence, dystopia or utopia. Both share a common assumption that the future will be radically different from the present. Hyperborea challenges this assumption. It suggests that the most meaningful changes may not be dramatic, they may be directional, subtle shifts in value. Reorientation rather than revolution. This reorientation begins with questions that are deceptively simple. How much is enough? What kind of complexity serves life rather than overwhelms it? Where should limits be embraced rather than resisted? These are not technical questions, they are ethical ones. Hyperborea places them back at the center of human concern. It is important to emphasize what Hyperborea is not. It is not an argument against modernity. It is not a call to abandon science, technology, or global cooperation. It is not nostalgia for a past that can be recreated. Hyperborea does not ask us to go backward, it asks us to look sideways, to consider paths not taken, values not prioritized, possibilities overshadowed by momentum. Momentum is powerful. It carries societies forward even when direction is unclear. Breaking momentum feels dangerous. Ancient myths understood this danger. They offered images of stillness, not as stagnation, but as recalibration. Hyperborea is one such image, a still point against which movement can be measured. As we approach the later movements of this documentary, the narrative will begin to narrow again, not toward conclusions, but toward responsibility. Because if Hyperborea represents balance, then the question is not whether such balance can exist in myth. The question is whether we are willing to value it in practice, not perfectly. Not permanently, but intentionally. This brings us to a final reflection for this part of the journey. Hyperborea has survived for thousands of years without armies, without institutions, without enforcement. It has survived because it speaks to something stable within human experience, the need for coherence, the desire for alignment, the intuition that more is not always better. These intuitions have not vanished. They have been buried beneath layers of complexity. Hyperborea does not ask us to dismantle civilization. It asks us to remember why we built it in the first place, not for speed, not for dominance, but for life, a life that feels intelligible, a life that feels connected, a life that feels whole. As we move into the next part, the final arc of this exploration will begin to take shape. We will confront the tension between myth and choice, between remembrance and responsibility, between what Hyperborea symbolizes and what the modern world demands. And we will ask quietly but insistently, if we no longer believe in Hyperborea as a place, what would it mean to believe in it as a principle? A principle once named demands action, not immediately, not loudly, but persistently. This is where Hyperborea becomes most unsettling, because principles do not remain abstract for long. They press against behavior. They expose contradictions. They ask whether values are merely spoken or actually lived. Hyperborea, understood as a principle, confronts us with a question modern civilization often avoids. What kind of life is all this power meant to serve? For most of history, power was visibly limited. Kings ruled small territories, technologies advanced slowly, ecological feedback was immediate and unforgiving. When balance was broken, consequences followed quickly. Modern power is different. It is abstracted, delayed, distributed. Decisions made in one place echo elsewhere years later through systems so complex that responsibility becomes difficult to trace. This diffusion of consequence creates a dangerous illusion that action can be separated from outcome. Hyperborea challenges that illusion at its root. The myth insists on proximity. In Hyperborea, action and consequence remain close. The people live within systems they can perceive, understand, and respond to directly. There's no buffer large enough to hide the effects of excess. This is not because the Hyperboreans are morally superior. It is because their scale enforces accountability. Modern societies have largely outgrown such enforcement, which makes principles more important than ever. Without internalized limits, external systems must compensate. Regulations proliferate, surveillance increases, complexity compounds. These measures are often necessary, but they are symptoms, not cures. They attempt to manage imbalance rather than address its cause. Hyperborea points to the cause, disconnection between decision and impact, between individual and community, between consumption and consequence. This disconnection erodes meaning even as it increases efficiency. People sense this erosion instinctively. They may not articulate it in philosophical terms, but they feel it as anxiety, restlessness, and fatigue. Hyperborea gives that feeling a narrative frame. Says something about the way we live no longer fits the way we are wired. This insight is not anti-modern, it is human. Humans evolved in environments where feedback was immediate and relationships were legible. Our nervous systems, social instincts, and moral intuitions developed under those conditions. Hyperborea reflects this ancestral alignment, not as a blueprint, but as a reminder. When systems grow faster than human capacities to understand and adapt, distress follows. This is not failure, it is biology. Modern culture often treats limits as problems to be solved. Faster processors, smarter algorithms, greater automation, but some limits are not technical, they are existential. No amount of efficiency can replace meaning. No amount of speed can substitute for coherence. Hyperborea insists on this distinction. This insistence is why the myth feels simultaneously gentle and confrontational. It does not accuse, it does not threaten. It simply refuses to validate the assumption that more is always better. That refusal alone is radical. Consider how modern identity is structured. We define ourselves by productivity, by achievement, by accumulation. Even leisure is optimized. Rest becomes recovery for further work rather than an end in itself. Hyperborea imagines a different orientation. In that world, life is not a means to something else. It is the point. This is not a call to abandon ambition. It is a call to interrogate it. Why do we pursue what we pursue? What are we willing to sacrifice, and for how long? What would it mean to say enough without shame? These questions rarely appear in economic models or policy debates, but they are central to human well-being. Hyperborea keeps them alive. At this stage, the myth functions less like a story and more like an ethical horizon, not a destination but a direction. It tells us which way balance lies, even if we never fully reach it. Such horizons are essential. Without them, movement becomes aimless, progress becomes inertia. This is why civilizations that lose their myths often struggle with meaning. Facts alone do not orient behavior. Data does not answer why. Efficiency does not determine value. Myths once filled this role not by dictating action but by shaping aspiration. Hyperborea shaped aspiration toward harmony rather than dominance. That aspiration has not vanished, it has been displaced. Displaced aspirations do not disappear. They resurface in distorted forms, in consumerism that promises fulfillment through acquisition, in productivity cultures that equate worth with output, in technological optimism that treats every problem as solvable through innovation. These are attempts to answer the same questions Hyperborea addressed, but without its emphasis on restraint. The result is dissatisfaction without clarity. Hyperborea offers clarity without certainty. It does not tell us exactly what to do. It tells us what to value: balance over excess, alignment over acceleration, wisdom over capability. These values are difficult to operationalize at scale, but difficulty does not negate importance. As this documentary approaches its later movements, the narrative arc becomes clear. We began with a forgotten land. We moved through myth, memory, distortion, and psychology. And now we arrive at responsibility, not collective guilt. Not utopian ambition, but responsibility in the simplest sense, the ability to respond. Hyperborea asks us to respond to imbalance not with denial but with attention, to listen to discomfort rather than anesthetize it, to question momentum rather than worship it, to consider limits not as enemies but as guides. This is a quiet ethic. It does not produce spectacle, but it produces sustainability. One of the most enduring misconceptions about ancient myths is that they belong to the past. In truth, myths belong to moments of transition. They resurface when old frameworks fail and new ones have not yet stabilized. We are living in such a moment. Technological capacity has outpaced ethical consensus. Global systems have outgrown local meaning. The future feels both open and unmoored. Hyperborea speaks directly into this uncertainty. It does not offer a vision of what the world will become. It offers a reminder of what humans require to feel at home in the world: coherence, belonging, proportion. These requirements have not changed, only our ability to ignore them has. This brings us to a final reflection for this part of the journey. Hyperborea has endured because it refuses to flatter. It does not tell us we are destined for greatness. It does not assure us that progress will save us. It does not promise redemption without cost. Instead, it suggests that the most important choices are not grand, they are directional, small shifts in value, subtle reorientations of attention, the willingness to ask whether speed is serving life or replacing it. If Hyperborea exists anywhere today, it exists in those questions, in the pause before excess, in the refusal to confuse growth with meaning, in the courage to value balance in a world that rewards acceleration. This is not a romantic ideal. It is a practical necessity. As we move forward into the next part, the final phase of this documentary will begin to crystallize. We will confront the implications of choosing balance in an unbalanced world. We will explore whether principles like those embodied by Hyperborea can survive without becoming dogma. And we will ask the most difficult question of all, not whether humanity can return to a lost harmony, but whether it can imagine a future that includes one. Imagination is not a luxury, it is a prerequisite for direction. Before any society changes its behavior, it changes its story. Before priorities shift, possibilities must be imagined. And before a future can include balance, balance must first be conceivable. This is where Hyperborea quietly exerts its final influence, not as nostalgia, not as prophecy, but as imaginative permission. Modern civilization often treats imagination as escapism, useful for entertainment but irrelevant to serious decision-making. Yet history tells a different story. Every major transformation began as an imagined alternative to the present. The idea of democracy, the idea of human rights, the idea of scientific inquiry itself. None of these emerged fully formed from data alone. They were imagined first. Hyperborea belongs to this category of ideas, not because it prescribes a system, but because it expands what can be imagined as desirable. To imagine balance in a culture oriented toward acceleration is an act of quiet resistance. It challenges the assumption that value must be justified by growth. It questions the belief that stability is synonymous with stagnation. It reframes restraint not as loss, but as intelligence. These reframings are subtle but profound. They open space where none seemed possible. One of the great obstacles to imagining balance today is fear. Fear of falling behind, fear of irrelevance, fear of being outpaced by systems that reward speed over coherence. These fears are not irrational. They are produced by competitive structures that punish pause. Hyperborea does not deny this reality. It simply asks whether competition should define everything. Ancient myths often functioned as counterweights. They did not dominate everyday life, but they softened its excesses. They reminded people that not all value is visible, not all success is measurable, and not all wisdom is loud. Hyperborea served this function. It was not invoked to solve problems. It was remembered to keep problems from becoming total. This is an important distinction. Hyperborea is not a solution. It is a constraint, a conceptual boundary that prevents ambition from consuming everything else. In engineering, constraints make systems stable. In ethics, they make systems humane. Hyperborea represents a constraint on excess, an insistence that life must remain intelligible to those living it. Modern societies often resist constraints because they appear to limit freedom. But freedom without orientation becomes anxiety. Choice without meaning becomes paralysis. Speed without direction becomes exhaustion. Hyperborea suggests that freedom flourishes within limits, not in their absence. This is a difficult lesson for cultures built on expansion, but it is not an optional one. As the documentary reaches this point, the arc is nearly complete. We began with a forgotten land beyond the north wind. We moved through myth, memory, distortion, psychology, ethics, and responsibility. What remains is synthesis, not an answer, but a posture. That posture is attentiveness. Attentiveness to scale, to consequence, to fit between systems and the humans who inhabit them. Hyperborea teaches attentiveness by contrast, by showing us a world where things fit so we can recognize when ours does not. It is tempting at this stage to ask what Hyperborea would look like today. What policies would it support? What technologies would it allow? What economies would it endorse? These questions, while understandable, miss the point. Hyperborea does not legislate, it orients. It does not tell us what to build. It helps us decide why we build at all. This orientation is increasingly rare. Modern discourse excels at means. It struggles with ends. We debate how to optimize systems whose purposes are rarely questioned. Hyperborea invites us to question purpose without prescribing outcomes. This makes it both powerful and uncomfortable. There is a reason Hyperborea never became a dominant ideology. It resists absolutism. It refuses to turn balance into dogma. The moment balance becomes rigid, it ceases to be balance. Hyperborea survives precisely because it remains flexible, an ideal that adjusts to context without dissolving into relativism. This flexibility allows Hyperborea to remain relevant across radically different eras. In agricultural societies, it critiqued excess extraction. In imperial societies, it critiqued domination. In industrial societies, it critiqued acceleration. In digital societies, it critiques abstraction. The core message remains the same: alignment matters. Alignment between humans and their tools, between ambition and consequence, between complexity and comprehension. When these alignments break, distress follows, no matter how advanced the society appears. Hyperborea recognizes this pattern and gives it symbolic form. At this point, the documentary does not need to persuade. It only needs to leave space. Space for the viewer to recognize where imbalance shows up in their own experience, in work that never ends. In systems that feel too large to influence, in speed that leaves little room for reflection. Hyperborea does not judge these experiences, it contextualizes them. This contextualization is perhaps the myth's greatest gift. It tells us that dissatisfaction is not always personal failure, that exhaustion is not always weakness, that longing for simplicity is not ignorance. Sometimes these are rational responses to environments that have drifted beyond human scale. Hyperborea names that drift. As we approach the close of this part of the journey, one final insight comes into focus. Hyperborea has endured not because it promises paradise, but because it preserves proportion. Proportion between effort and reward, between desire and fulfillment, between power and responsibility. This is not a fantasy. It is a requirement for sustainability, psychological, social, and ecological. If there is a lesson embedded in Hyperborea, it is not that humanity must return to some imagined past. It is that humanity must remember how to ask certain questions before it is too late to answer them. Questions like, what are we optimizing for? Who benefits from this speed? What is being sacrificed quietly? These questions slow us down. And slowing down in a culture that equates speed with success is a radical act. Hyperborea does not demand that act, it invites it. It stands quietly at the edge of our imagination, reminding us that another orientation is possible, even if it is difficult, even if it is partial, even if it is imperfect. As this part concludes, the shape of the journey ahead becomes clear. The final movement of this documentary will not seek resolution. It will seek integration. It will ask how ancient myths can inform modern choice without becoming prescriptions or ideologies. It will explore whether balance can be pursued intentionally in a world built on acceleration. And it will return one last time to the central question that has guided this exploration from the beginning, not whether Hyperborea existed, but whether we still recognize the conditions it represents and whether we are willing to value them. Because in the end, Hyperborea was never about a place beyond the map. It was about a direction we can still choose. Every journey needs an ending. But some endings are not conclusions, they are openings. We began this documentary with a question about a forgotten land beyond the north wind, a place that never appeared clearly on maps yet refused to disappear from memory. Along the way, Hyperborea stopped being a destination and became something far more demanding, a mirror, a measure, a reminder, not of where humanity once lived, but of how it once imagined living. And now, as we stand at the edge of this story, the responsibility quietly shifts, from myth to meaning, from listening to choosing. Because Hyperborea does not belong to the past, it belongs to the moment when we decide what matters. If this journey resonated with you, it is not because you believe in lost continents or hidden civilizations. It is because somewhere along the way you recognize the tension it describes, between speed and purpose, between growth and balance, between power and wisdom. That recognition is not accidental. It is the reason myths endure long after belief fades. They speak when data cannot. Hyperborea never asked to be found, it asked to be remembered. Remembered as a question we should never stop asking. What kind of life is worth building? Not the fastest, not the largest, not the most dominant, but the most coherent. If this documentary gave you something to think about, something to question, to reconsider, or even to disagree with, then the conversation is just beginning. And conversations like this only survive when people choose to keep them alive. So if you found value here, subscribe, not just for algorithms, not just for notifications, but to stay part of a space where ideas are explored slowly, carefully, and without shouting. A space where myth is not mocked, history is not simplified, and questions are allowed to remain open. I'd also like to hear from you, not what you were told to think, but what you felt while watching. Did Hyperborea feel familiar? Did it feel unsettling? Did it challenge something you assumed was certain? Leave a comment, share what stayed with you after the screen went dark, and tell us where you're watching from. Because one of the quiet ironies of Hyperborea is this: a myth about distance has brought people together from different countries, cultures, and perspectives into the same conversation. That matters. If you're watching from the north, the south, the east, or the west, your perspective is part of this story. If you're watching late at night, early in the morning, or during a stolen moment of quiet, this story was made for that space, because Hyperborea was never about geography. It was about orientation. And finally, remember this: you do not have to believe in Hyperborea to take it seriously. You only have to notice when life feels out of balance, when speed replaces meaning, when complexity replaces clarity, when progress stops feeling like improvement. Those moments are not failures, they are signals. Ancient myths listened to those signals. We still can. Thank you for taking this journey. Thank you for listening carefully. Thank you for questioning quietly. And wherever you are watching from, welcome. The map may be full, but the conversation is not.